We're in Psalm 88 right now. I got to apologize. I was supposed to get this out last week, and I just realized that it didn't get sent. It's been kind of sitting in my inbox and tried to open it, and I couldn't open it, so I'm re recording it now. So, my apologies, but we'll stay on track with the Psalms ultimately. This psalm is probably the saddest psalm that we're going to come across in the Psalter. And it's not just me saying that, others have read this psalm and come to the same conclusion. And it's really a reminder, and I think it's important to remind ourselves that as Christians, we are not beyond feeling deep, deep despair. In fact, I'd suggest that in some ways, we as Christians should perhaps feel despair the deepest at sometimes. I mean, who else would know the despair of the fallenness of man and inability to save himself and the judgment that's coming and the tribulation that's going to come upon the earth? I mean, there are multiple reasons why we should, at some point, I think, in our lives and some time, feel despair. That's what we find in this psalm. We find a maskil, a wisdom psalm again, of Heman the Israelite. In Psalm 89, we come across Ethan, Ezrahite. And these two guys are so wise that they're compared to Solomon of all people. So pray that, sometime in our life we're called to be as wise. We're compared to Solomon in wisdom, but that's the depth of wisdom that they have in their lives. And the Mahalath Leanoth in the superscript, and remember these superscripts here are actually part of the psalm. I'm not showing you the psalm. It's actually a part of the psalm. It means dance of affliction. So we get an introduction about what's coming here. And it shouldn't surprise us, really, that this is despair is part of the Christian life. Isaiah 53:3 says that Jesus in his humanity was a man of sorrows. I'm guessing he experienced some of the despair that Heman had. And because of that, we can be comforted in knowing that Jesus can have a very deep empathy and compassion for you if you find yourself in this kind of despair. I'm not going to go through an outline here. I want you to read the psalm, read it prayerfully, meditatively, slowly. See if there's not places in here where you can perhaps identify with, maybe experience of despair and deep sorrow in the past. Or I pray that if you are in this kind of despair now, that you will find help in the words of the psalm. So let's look at our here verse. Begin with our highlight and explain. I want to point out this phrase, enough troubles. Did you see that? Enough troubles. Notice the plural there, the plural, troubles. Heman, the psalmist, has been overwhelmed with not just one trouble, but trouble after trouble after trouble. They keep coming, they don't end. He's reached his limit. His soul has had enough. He can't stand anymore. Have you ever felt that way? Have you ever had experiences in your life where you just were overwhelmed with one trouble after another? Sometimes I think of Job and what happened to his family and all the afflictions that he had and all the sicknesses that came upon him. And sometimes that happens to us, doesn't it? He says in the second cola here, my life has drawn near to Sheol. Well, Sheol is kind of a mysterious place of the dead. In the Old Testament believer didn't have a developed, what I'd say, eschatology, a developed understanding of the end times. He didn't have all the revelation we had, but he did know that there was a place that the dead go to. They're conscious, they're alive, they're aware, but they're also freed from the suffering of this earth. And he feels as if his life is drawing near to the end. He's at death's door, in other words, and about to give up. How do we apply this? This is a difficult psalm as we think through it. Perhaps you've read it already. Perhaps you're about to. Let me suggest a couple ways to apply this. Number one, as I said at the outset, let's remember that life is not a bed of roses, especially for the Christian. That's you and I. To be Christ-like, in fact, is to suffer. Jesus suffered, I think, in every possible way. And yet God exalted him. God lifted him up. God glorified him. He didn't leave him in suffering. He didn't just leave him there. So if you're feeling or have felt anything like Haman, let me just encourage you with all gentleness to embrace that suffering. This is your fellowship with Christ. This is your union with him. This is an aspect of being joined with him in salvation and in his life. So join in the fellowship of his suffering today. Know that you are identifying with Christ, perhaps in the deepest way possible in his suffering. And God forbid, but I know that some do feel this despair so deep that they not only draw near to Sheol, but they want to step through the gates of death as if it would be better than continuing in life. Brothers and sisters, if you find yourself feeling suicidal, let me encourage you just yet again to embrace your fellowship with Christ in his suffering. Christ didn't allow his suffering to overwhelm him to the point where he committed suicide. No, he committed himself to doing his Father's will to the very end. If you are suffering with Christ right now, embrace that suffering. And if you are feeling suicidal, then immediately after you acknowledge that you're suffering with Christ, get help. I'd encourage you to call a hospital, to call 911, to get a pastor, call a suicide hotline, but to get help right now. Help is available. That's what this psalm is telling you. Heman pressed on, and so can you. So if you find yourself in Heman-like sorrow and despair, I find that through this psalm, perhaps something I said, you'd find yourself comforted knowing that you're not alone. That Jesus himself, he was a man of sorrow. He was a man acquainted with grief. He's a man who was despised, and he was a man who was not esteemed. Jesus carries his wounds with him in heaven. Jesus is empathetic and sympathetic and wants to reach out to you. He wants to be with you in your suffering. He wants to help. Don't give up. God bless you, brother and sister.